architecture, a bit of logging, and everything remaining, which is about the storage integration options. So these are the things which we're going to look into. So without any further delay, let's get started with a quick recap. I hope everybody was able to download this whiteboard and the design document from yesterday. I've shared the links. If you have failed to do so, you can get the links from yesterday's chat history. Okay, do let me know if you want me to post it here again. So yesterday we started with basics of storage. So we started with the definition of storage, what it is, what are the different types, how data is categorized, how you decide which data goes where. So this is where we have talked about structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data. For an e-commerce website, you will see all these three types of data. That's what we have learned. Sales data, customers data, that's where the MS SQL comes into picture. Product catalog, Cosmo database, which is semi-structured. Unstructured is where we are talking about Azure blobs coming into play, right? Qualitative versus quantitative, blob file object. Then we have talked about what is Azure file storage. If you remember yesterday, what I did was I started to create a storage account. Once you have the storage account, you can create containers, tables, queues, and files, which are the services which it has to offer. So the first point here is, what is Microsoft Cloud Storage Solution? Azure Storage. What data services does it offer? All these things. Hey, it offers blobs, which are object storage solution, which can be massively scalable. Azure Files, which are file shares, Azure Queues, which are messaging stores, right? Azure Tables, NoSQL store for schema-less storage for storing any kind of data, right? Azure Disks, block-level storage volumes. Reasons why you would choose that: security, scalability, managed service, provides high availability and durability, and accessible from anywhere. This is where we did talk about how we are going to access it. That's where the service URL terminology comes into play. So https:// the storage account .blob.co.windows.net. That's what we have learned. What else? We also talked about how there are two types of storage accounts. So we have talked about standard versus premium, right? Standard, general purpose V2. Premium, we have block blobs, we have premium file shares, and we have premium page blobs. Way to go select this while creating the storage account from the portal, we can select this option. Then we have talked about what are blobs in general, what are the 3 steps that you do in order to create a blob. All the files that I've been sharing from last 2 days is via the container. The files are acting as like the objects in my storage account. So this is where we have talked about, hey, use case can be any of this. And that's why in our yesterday's case study, we did discuss for media files, we would go with blobs. And because we wanted the warm state, write once, read many, we went with blobs even for your corporate documents. And then we have talked about how blobs are like the backbone for Azure Data Lake Storage. And to get started, the first step is to create a storage account, which is a unique namespace in Azure. Yesterday I did show you that, like the name must be common because it's a platform as a service. The second step is to create a container. A container is just a logical folder where we keep your blobs. And then the object itself is a blob where your data resides. Different types of blobs, blob, FN blob, page blob, which one to use when, we have discussed this. Then we have talked about file shares, NFS versus SMB, use cases, benefits. Then we have looked into table storage, which is where we introduced you to something called Cosmo database, which is the predecessor for Azure table storage. 3 steps for that: storage account, tables, and entities. An entity is just a collection of properties, basically information which can be similar to the data that we keep in a database row, right? Then we have talked about managed disks. Hey, managed disks means you just highlight the type of disk and the size of disk. The remaining all aspects of the management is offloaded to the cloud provider. Then we have looked into the terminologies like what do you mean by geography, what do you mean by region, what is your availability zone, what are data centers. And this is where we have talked about the redundancy options. So LRS, ZRS, GRS, GZRS. And then read access when we are configuring GRS and GZRS. I'm not going deeper here, but we did spend some time yesterday. So this here gives you a quick sense of understanding. We saw the KB article where we saw the pictures already. Then we jumped into access tiers. Can somebody tell me What is the time period for cold storage? You see hot, cool, and archive. Archive I've written 180 days. Cool I've written 30 days. What is cold? So there was cool and there was cold, right? 90 days. That's the right answer. So depending upon how frequently you're going to access the data, you need to define your access tier. Now keep in mind, you have the lifecycle management rules with which you can control how your data moves from one tier to another tier. This primarily helps you to reduce your costs associated with your data itself. Archive tier is the cheapest. We saw, right? From $21, it was like 0.99 cents, which was like the cheapest. That's why we say lowest storage cost. However, if you want to retrieve your data, you're going to pay more. Why? Because data retrieval charges are high. And then on top of it, you might end up with a penalty if you don't keep the data in archive state for 180 days. Let's say you put the data for 180 days and at 90th day, you decided to make it hot, which means you're re-editing the data. So what will happen? You have to pay an early deletion fee because 180 minus 90 remaining 90 days. So we will charge you as if you have kept the data for 90 days in that archive tier. So that's why time and again we remind you that hey, use archive tier only in compliance situations where you are asked to keep the data for a very long time. For example, I told you about hospitals. Certain hospitals in Singapore, in order to stay compliant as per the government policies, they have to maintain the customer records before they can destroy them. So that's exactly what we are talking about. And then strategies with which you can secure your storage account. This is where we emphasized on SAS, shared access signatures, which talks about three things: what resource, how long, what permission. So these are the three things. SAS works on URI, which includes your storage resource URL plus the SAS token, which defines what is the start time, expired time, protocol, and the signature. And this is where we also talked about immutable storage policy, which is basically write once, read many, which means you can't basically modify the data once it has been added, or you can't delete the data once it has been added. So the point to remember, which I said was, hey, in warm state, when it is in immutable storage policy, time-based retention, what happens when the time expires? I told you that you would be allowed to modify it, but not delete it. So that's something which you need to consider. So that's something which we saw from the KB article as well. Now, while we were talking about which storage to go with, primarily when we were discussing a comparison between NFS and blob storage, we talked about IOPS and throughput. If it is the better bandwidth that you're looking for, go with which one? Files or blobs, guys? Which one gives you better throughput? Which one gives you better IOPS? We are doing a comparison between Azure file shares and blob storage. IOPS means read-write operations per second. Throughput means IOPS into IO size. So that's why IOPS is always calculated in transactions, like how many read-writes, like 7,500, 8,000, 80,000. And then on the other side, so question to you guys is, which solution would you choose for better IOPS versus for better throughput? So the options are Azure Files and Azure Blobs. Think about it, share your responses. Let me see if I can find that slide from yesterday to refresh your knowledge. So resolution, we can go with 3. So yeah, this was the one which we saw. We want you all to remember this. Which one is good for IOPS with respect to performance per volume? Always remember Azure files. This is the point where we have discussed about IOPS versus throughput. So whenever it's a point for throughput, better throughput, always go for logs. All good people, just give me a thumbs up if you're following me. And then we also talked about how you can integrate it with Azure Active Directory, how you can bring in the default encryption option, which is enabled using the Microsoft managed keys. We can bring in your own keys. Then we have talked about how generally I can use tools like Storage Explorer in order to get connected using either the key or a screen. Rather than sharing and giving you full control, this is where we said we will use SAS. Client-side encryption can also be enabled from the application front, which is basically to encrypt the data in transit. So all these options are available for you to get started. Then we have talked about Azure File Sync, which can help you convert any Windows machine on-premise or cloud into a quick cache component for your Azure file shares. The example which we discussed was, hey, if Contoso is a multinational company and you have offices in different locations like SFO, Singapore, Dubai, and rather than having local directories, if you're consolidating these directories into one cloud directory, you can do that. And when they do that, they need that flexibility and performance, right? This is where Azure File Sync can help you. What it does is, hey, any frequently accessed data, let me cache it so that tomorrow when you want to connect to it and then get it back, rather than going to the cloud, you're connecting to the local machine. So that way the performance is improved and productivity is increased. I told you that Azure File Sync can also help you with the migration projects wherein you want to move your data from one location to the cloud. Somebody did compare it with AZ Copy. AZ Copy was a feature which is a CLI tool, right? Which does the similar operations, but this one is more GUI, more Windows interfaces. Then we have talked about snapshots. Snapshots are point in time read-only copy of your data. That's something which we have seen. Protects your data against accidental deletions, internet changes, any kind of application errors, or data corruption scenarios. After that, we also talked about security aspects like, hey, can I bring in service endpoints and private endpoints? The picture, what you see on screen, talks about how, rather than relying on internet to communicate with your storage account, which is a public endpoint, you use service endpoints, which rely on the backbone network of Microsoft to establish the communication. Now, what did we discuss? Even though you have service endpoints configured, if environments like on-prem want to access your storage account, they can still get routed via internet. Hey, what if I want to deploy a storage account and not give access from the internet at all? So that's where the private endpoints come into play. And this is the diagram for the private endpoint. The stop sign is to tell you that any communication from the internet is blocked. If you want to establish the communication, hey, the only way to get started is you go via the private endpoint. What does it do? Private endpoint adds a network adapter to your subnet in your VNet, gets a private IP address. So when the communication is getting established, the communication is always over the private IP address rather than the public IP address. So this we do this practically, and we do show demos in a training program called AZ-305. Okay. Even in AZ-104, there is no service endpoint or private endpoint lab. But in AZ-305 course, there's a lab where you can perform these actions. After this, we jumped into the post-lunch session, which is where we have talked about databases, the 3 different options available for Azure SQL, the licensing options available for Azure SQL, DTU versus vCore versus within vCore compute versus serverless architecture. Then the service tiers, general purpose, business critical, and hyperscale. Depending upon your requirements, you would choose one. We also talked about the data security aspects, which is where we've talked about, hey, the first thing would be to classify the data into public, confidential, and restricted, and depending upon your classification, implementing the data protection measures, which could be, but not limited to, data at rest encryption, data in transit through SSL or TLS certificates, data in process through dynamic data masking, or always encrypted option. So these were the things which we discussed. Apart from this, we also talked about a firewall configurable option. And finally, we also talked about the scalability, like, hey, how you want to grow your database. It completely depends on what kind of deployment mode are we following. So this is where we ended our lecture. We did 2 case studies. If I can bring the case study document just to give you a quick reference. So this was the one which I've shared yesterday with you all, 1673 design. So yesterday we did case study number 3 and 4. So if you scroll down, these were the points collected by Vijay yesterday. So this was a case study which we did for non-relational storage solution. So if you correlate, we said we will go with hot tier for media and corporate documents, and then a cool tier for corporate documents, and then we will implement something called lifecycle management capabilities. So that's what you have written here. And then we also talked about implementation of service endpoints in order to help access the internet applications over the backbone network rather than going through the internet. That makes a lot more sense, right? And then we also talked about immutable storage policies here, which is warm state for your corporate documents. So that's something, points that we see here. And then what else? We said we will go with 2 storage accounts, one standard and one premium. Standard being for the testing environment and premium being for the production environments. Security strategies will be all of this. So that's what we have learned. And this is how a simple diagram would look like. If you want to allow an application to access the web page related content from the storage account. So the front end is your application gateway, which is a layer 7 firewall, layer 7 load balancer, which has its own integrated component called web application firewall. Then you have your app services, then you have your storage account. From storage account, the services which we are looking into is blob and Azure files, and then the tiers which we are looking is hot and cool. So like the diagram says, this is what we have. And then we said, hey, Azure files will be mounted to the internal employees through a direct drive. So that's what we are showing you here. And also the website will access the media literature content from the file share. So that's what we have learned. Few points on the same. And ZRS is a dependency which we agreed to. Then when we talk about relational storage case study, so we said we have 2 options. One, to go with Redis cache. If the budget is not of a constraint, then 2, we said we will go with Redis cache, as well as we will bring in business critical deployment of Azure. So these are the 2 options which we have discussed. Private endpoints, DB, dynamic data masking, integration with Azure Active Directory, selecting Azure SQL database for pricing factor. We saw that yesterday from the pricing country, right? Which one is the cheapest? Sharding to be considered, and then business critical for high availability. So these are the 5 points: authorization, authentication, pricing, performance, and high availability, on which we discussed the case study. So that's where we stopped yesterday. Any questions from yesterday, guys? Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me so far. So that was a quick recap of day 2. Okay. Just give me a minute. Let me grab my water bottle. I forgot that looks like it. Let me grab some water, and then we will start with IAM today. So I have the content ready. So while I step away, the question for the day. Let's start with the question. The first question is, what is IAM for you? IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. What is IAM for you? First question. Second question. What the price demands from an IAM solution? Think about these two questions. I'll be back in a minute and then we will get started. When you hear the term IAM, what comes to your mind? What is the main purpose of IAM?
From our perspective, we have multiple IAM, so which is IT access management. So we got staff, we got partners, customers, we got anonymous customers, and then we have like in the bank we have something called new to bank (NTB), and those are so-called like probable. That means someone who's, for example, is going to apply for a loan, but they're still not a customer. So, but we still need to identify them and provide identity.
So identity has always been about who you are. Can I say that?
Yep.
This is not but authentication, right? And then we do authentication with multiple factors. For example, when you say somebody wants to apply a loan, the first thing that they have to do is they have to register themselves, wherein they will provide their username, password, full name, address, email ID, and then some documents which are required by the bank to identify them. Isn't that?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to highlight here is in an enterprise, you can identify a person using multiple factors. One way is with something you know. What do you mean by something you know? Example, we are talking about username and passwords. Okay. What about the second one? Something you have. So what do you mean by something you have? Example, RSA, secure, ID, tokens. Or it could be even your mobile app, like authenticator. So here in Singapore, when you open up an account with banks like BPS, what they do is for every customer they give a hardware token, RSA security token. So they will send out an OTP to your phone. You punch in that OTP into the hardware device, that will give you a 6-digit PIN, and you will enter that PIN to complete the task. It's not for every transaction, but some transactions where they think that you might not be the person who you say to be, just want to for the authentication, right? So that's where those hardware ID tokens come into play. The third option is something you are, which is basically what we are using in today's time. For example, to log into my laptop, I don't use anymore. I don't even remember my password. Believe me when I say this. I know my PIN, which is a 4-digit. Microsoft has made it easy to log into the machines, but I forgot my NT user ID and password. Every time I just open my laptop, it recognizes my face and allows me to log in. So identity has always been about your authentication. Yep. Thanks, Vijay. I see there's another point from Vijay. There was one question yesterday we had around having the codes here for off-season school. Yeah. When we say off-season school, again, you can't derive the content separately. Rather, you would, I would say, you can put it in a separate container, and then you can define a rule for that particular container. Okay, that's something which is like doable. So, yep. What are we saying then? Access is where we are talking about what can you do. And this is where the term authorization comes into play. So IAM is a solution which gives you authentication and authorization. Can somebody tell me how we do authorization? Yet Entra ID is something which we can look out for. How are we doing authorizations? What can we perform? Roles, exactly. So that's where the term RBAC, role-based access control, comes into play. So that was the first point. What is an IAM solution? Okay. Now, what an enterprise demands from an IAM solution. So again, let's divide this into same thing, identity and access. So when we say identity, the first primary thing as an architect that you must consider is, hey, how am I going to offer a unified identity management solution? Unified identity management solution. What do you mean by this statement? Unified identity management solution. So what we are trying to highlight here is manage all your identities and access to all your applications in a central location. So this makes more sense primarily when we are talking about hybrid deployments. What do you mean by that? So let me bring your attention to the KV, to the whiteboard for the street. KV3. So this is what we said, I am. And then, do I have a picture here? Unified access management. Hold on, I'm just scrolling down to see if I have a diagram. No, I don't have it. So I want to show you this. I'll come back to this in a minute. So you go here, you type ADDS, AZ, AD, ADFS. Activity report. This one. Okay. What do you see on this picture? Can somebody tell me? Can you talk about this picture a bit? Let us add this picture here so that later when I share this with you all, we have this. Somehow it doesn't like to copy over. Let's check the screenshot. So what can you make out of this diagram? That's my first question, guys. What do you see here? Can somebody tell me this or explain me this diagram? When it doesn't have to be technical, what do you learn? When you look at this diagram, what is that you understand?
It is AD federated to Azure Active Directory.
Wonderful. Federation is basically establishing trust between your Active Directory, domain services, and Azure Active Directory. Point number one. Very good. But what is the other point that you see on screen?
Using AD to access all the SaaS applications.
Wonderful. Using AD or managing all your SaaS applications. And when I say line of business applications, it is applications which you have created in-house. Okay. So what is Azure Active Directory doing? Azure Active Directory is authenticating and authorizing only access to your M365. So we don't like this. So what we wanted was something unified. What do you mean by unified? There should be one control plane for all your authentication and authorization requirements. So how are we transforming? Check this out. You see the difference between the two pictures? What do you understand here? Where are your SaaS applications going? Where are your line of business applications going? Where is Office 365 going? So it's the same thing, but what we did is, hey, we need unified identity management, which means we need a central location, whether they are in cloud or in premise, to give access to the resource, improve visibility and control. Does it make sense? So when I say unified access management, sorry, unified identity management, uh, this is what we are talking about. Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me. I'll just.
So what's the relation between that federated AD and Azure AD?
Hold on. Okay, just that link. Yeah, what's your question? Can you repeat that for me?
So the federated AD used by on-prem apps is also talked the Azure AD. So what is the relation here?
Okay, let me take you back to the whiteboard. We first post that link here. Let's say Vijay is an on-premise user, right? He is an on-premise user, and Vijay wants to access SharePoint Online. Now, SharePoint Online sits here, right? It's an Office 365 application. So, what happens when Vijay says, I want to connect to you, your SharePoint Online redirects you. Where does it redirect? Redirects you to Azure Active Directory because this is your identity provider. So, what will Vijay do? Vijay will provide his credentials to the identity provider. Now, the question is, in simple terms, an identity provider is just a repository where you have user account information, isn't that? Users, groups, devices, all that information is what I have here. Now the question is, do I have Vijay's information? Is Vijay a cloud user? No, not by default. Vijay is an on-premise user. So this is where we do something called home realm discovery, which means Vijay gets redirected back to his Active Directory domain services, saying that, hey, Vijay, I don't think you belong to my domain. Okay, so what I want to do is go back to the original guy, which is your Active Directory domain services, where you have your ADFS component, which offers the single sign-on capabilities. Please authenticate yourself and get back to me. So what will this guy do? Active Directory domain services, he trusts you, right? He's gonna authenticate you and is going to forward the authentication token to your Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. What will Azure Active Directory do? Validates the token information, trusts you, and then gives you access to the application. Not directly, but what it does is it creates another token, gives you that token, so that the initial authentication request to SharePoint Online works. So Vijay will then present that new token to SharePoint Online, and then the SharePoint Online will validate this. So why am I talking all of this? Because here in between, let me change color. Let me put something blue. So here in between, you have a component called AD Connect. The job of AD Connect is to synchronize user account information from your on-premise to Azure Active Directory. When that sync, for some reason, didn't have your account information cached over here, then that's where the home realm discovery happens and all this authentication process works behind the screen. Does that make sense?
Yes, done.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my AZ-104 class from last week. Right, I'm going to go back to this is BL. Okay, let me find AZ-104. Okay, 104, day 1. Let me capture. We generally talk a little bit more on IAM on AZ-104. So yeah, this part. So let me post this diagram first. And then you guys can look at the steps. And one, some reason it didn't capture the screenshot. Let's try it one more time. Check check out the chat box, guys. You will see this screenshot. I will just add that here to our whiteboard as well, current whiteboard as well. Okay. Now, as you can see here, in this case, it's not Vijay but Alex. This is what we said, right? Alex, an on-premise user, wants to access SharePoint Online. What is happening? SharePoint Online says, get me a token. Because in modern authentication, like SAML or WS Federation, you need a token to get access. So to get a token, what are you doing? You're contacting your identity provider. So who's your IDP here? Your Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory, let's say, doesn't know who Alex is. This is where we do something called home VLAN discovery. So your request for authentication is then forwarded to your on-premise Active Directory setup. Your ADDS and ADFS confirms that Alex is a valid user, creates a token and forwards it to Azure Active Directory. It validates the token, confirms that Alex is a valid user. Then it creates another token and forwards it to the initial request placed by Alex. Because remember, the first step was getting redirected to Azure Active Directory. So it responds back with a token now. It responds back with a token. So what is Alex doing? Alex will present that token to SharePoint Online. What is SharePoint Online doing? It validates the token information with the user, with the Azure Active Directory and gives access to the user. Just give me a thumbs up if everybody is following me. So the main important component here to worry about is Azure AD Connect. Okay?
As SharePoint is doing the introspection of the token with the AD, is it? Before giving the access.
SharePoint Online is because it's registered with Azure Active Directory. Basic of any application that's registered with Azure Active Directory is, hey, please get a token from me by talking to the identity provider. For example, I think we will be talking about this going forward, but let me just show you. For example, let's say you have an on-premise application that you want to register with Azure Active Directory. To do that, you go to Azure Active Directory. Okay, let me refresh the session here. Why is not refreshing?
讲完了。OK， 这个这样。
好吧。Item. So, app registrations. Let's say you have an application called fabricam.org. Okay, so let's call this as demo 51673 app. Okay, now if you read this line, it says here, hey, will return the authentication response to this URI after successfully authenticating the user. Isn't this what we said? Whenever a user wants to access an application, he has to provide the credentials. Once I validate the credentials, I have to forward a token to the responding application that he's trying to access. Now, this is where you tell me, hey, what kind of application it is. Let's say it is a web application. And whom do I forward it to? So let's say you want to forward it to fabricam.org/auth. Okay? And then you just say register. This will give you two components, which is your global object as well as service principal, which we'll talk in some time. But hope this gives you more insight, Vijay. Thanks for the thumbs up. Let's get going.
Hi. But you said that the application will connect to the AZ and validate the token.
That's correct.
But here we are just adding the application into the AZ-AD.
Yeah. So you're registering the application to AZ-AD so that AZ-AD can take care of all the authentication, whoever is trying to access that application. So going back to the diagram which we saw, this is what we did now. So the line of business application was fabricam.com, for example. And how did I integrate it with my Azure Active Directory? That's where the process of app registration came into picture. So what will Azure Active Directory do now? Any user who's trying to access this application gets redirected here. He will validate the credentials. Once he validates the credentials, he's creating a token, right? Because any mode of authentication requires token to establish the communication. Where do I forward this token? It has to come back to the application, right? So that's what we did. So the registration process is not just to integrate Azure Active Directory, but it also tells you where should I forward the token that gets generated once the authentication is successful. Does that make sense?
So you mean that AZ-AD will forward the token to user or application directly?
Application.
Okay.
Via user session. So it also, it gives you two tokens basically. Something called RT, refresh token, and then there is something called active token or access token. Okay. So these are the two tokens which it gives. Refresh token is if this guy is performing a task and it's in progress, and if the token expires, it will automatically use the refresh token and get you a new token. And then it also places a cookie on user's browser session so that tomorrow when that user tries to access another application that is registered with Azure Active Directory, he doesn't have to provide his credentials again. Why? Because I trust him already. That's why if you have tested single sign-on in your environment, single sign-on works only when you're using your browser in a normal mode. But the moment you go incognito or in private window, because there are no cookies, you will be asked to relog in, provide your credentials again. Have you observed that? Anybody who has experienced it before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how the behavior is. Hope that answers your query, Vijay. Why we are doing what we are doing?
Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So back to the notepad. The first question which we answered was what is an IAM? The second question what we are answering is, hey, with respect to identity, what does an enterprise want? So this is where we said unified identity management. What do you mean by unified identity management? When you have a hybrid deployment, when you have user account information at Azure Active Directory as well as Active Directory domain services, I need some kind of integration between them, right? That's exactly what we are talking about. And then seamless user experience is something which an enterprise looks out for. So let's write it down. Seamless user experience. What do you mean by this? Provide an easy way to users to log in fast. Give them options to stay productive. For example, if they want to reset their passwords, we have a feature called SSPR, Self-Service Password Reset, right? Which increases the end user's productivity because they don't have to wait on the IT team to reset the passwords for their accounts, right? So this is one of the best things that you can do with identity. And then with respect to access, what we are trying to highlight here is, hey, provide secure, adaptive access. What do you mean by secure, adaptive access? Bring policies with which you protect access to your data or application using strong authentication. So this is something which we are saying. And then simplified identity governance. Whenever they talk about identity governance, we are talking about things like privileged identity management. We are talking about entitlement management. We are talking about things like access reviews. license reviews. Then we are talking about auditing. All these things come into play. So there's a course called SC300. SC300, which is talking about Azure Active Directory for 4 days. So all 4 days, we only talk Azure Active Directory. I've just posted this information in the chat box. Take 10 seconds. Check out the points. Let me know if you have any questions. Give me a thumbs up.
Sorry.
So far.
When you say seamless user experience, what is the comparison between the user experience directly towards Azure AD compared to the on-prem? What is the main advantages on that?
I mean, when we say seamless user experience here, we're talking about ways with which you can keep your employees productive. Like I said, one simple example here is managing your passwords. So let the employees reset the passwords by themselves, okay? And then configure user risk policies and sign-in risk policies so that they can connect to the environment from anywhere. For example, my home office is Singapore, but sometimes I go for holiday to India and extend my work from India for a week, right? Generally, I do that, which means I should be having the flexibility to work from India. But wait a minute, my office is in Singapore, but I'm working from India. So what do I have to go through? Because the applications are intelligent these days. Azure Active Directory is intelligent. What it does is it implements something called an access policy, which means, hey, the moment I figure out that your location is different than what you log in from, let me just do an extra level of authentication, which is where it will implement MFA, multi-factor authentication, where I just have to authenticate myself one more time with an additional factor like an authenticator app or a telephone call, and after that I get access. So the user experience here that we're talking about is how you can make it flexible and how you can give them more control to do day-to operations with ease without relying on the IT teams. Does it make sense?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Welcome. So that was a quick intro. So let's go back to the whiteboard here to get started with IAM. We will talk about most of these features that I've just mentioned here today, and then slowly we will go forward. So what I've written here is the basic definition for IAM, which we have discussed. And then we already know this. When you get started with Azure, like when you create a free account, the first thing that you get is a tenant and a subscription. Tenant is where the identity provider comes into play. Now, why is identity most important? Let me ask this question. How many of you guys have heard about the term defense in depth? The reason why I'm bringing defense in depth is to explain this diagram here. What you see is Alex, who's a standalone user who wants to connect to cloud and access his resources. The first thing, what happens is he will go into his laptop, go to https://portal.azure.com. The moment he does that, what is the first thing you see? Validation. Who you are. That's where authentication happens. So why is authentication so important? All this is related to something called defense in depth. Anybody who have heard this term before? Defense in depth. What is defense in depth, guys? The J says yes. What is defense in depth?
It provides a multi-layer security.
Wonderful. So layered security approach is what we call it as defense in depth. So what I've done, I've just typed defense in depth Azure, and then this is the first diagram which comes into play, right? So I'm just going to copy this diagram. When you copy over this diagram, what you see is after the physical layer, the first thing that you need to protect is your identity. Because you're talking about cloud, physical is covered by the provider himself, which means Microsoft will take care of it, like those James Bond movies and what do you call it, Mission Impossible, right? I know there's a data center in Singapore. I know it's in Jurong. Jurong is the area in Singapore, but I don't know which building because nobody knows. Even though I'm working for Microsoft, I don't know which building in Jurong the data center is, right? So identity and access is very, very important because this acts like the front guard of protecting your resources, right? So he is the one who stands first and then protects and then confirms only that validated users get access to your resources. Now, this is where we talked about things like, hey, I will bring in identity protection. So whenever you see the term identity protection, you have to understand something called conditional access policies. You have to understand risks which are based on identity or user himself. So this is where identity risks and user risk comes into play. Not identity, I should say sign-in risks. Okay, let me change color. Sorry, let me erase that. Sign-in. And then identity access also deals with something called identity governance. Conditional access policies is where you can use to implement multi-factor authentication. And we just discussed governance includes 4 things: privileged identity management, entitlement management. We are talking about access reviews. And then what else? The last one was auditing. Apart from this, we do a lot more, but these are most important things. Now, if you remember, Azure Active Directory is available to you in multiple different editions. Let me see if I have licensing edition. Yeah, see here? This picture talks about the different licensing options available with Azure Active Directory. So the free one is limited, but when we talk about identity protection, identity governance, conditional access policy, check this out. It's only available to you with P1 and P2. If you want hybrid identity, you need P1 and P2. Most of the time, your enterprise will have a P2 license. Let's check that now. What license do you have? How do I check it? Go to Home. Search for Azure Active Directory. Under Overview, License, you will see it. I want everyone to do this exercise and update me what license you see there. Go to Home, Azure Active Directory, under Overview, License. What license do you have? P1, P2, or a free one? I want everyone to try this. Go to Home, search for Azure Active Directory. Okay, unfortunately, Advent doesn't let me to read. That's all right. Slowly, you will get into an environment where you will have access to. Okay. I mean, the reason why I ask you to check this out is so that you know how your current setup, your current environments have been configured or have been set up. Okay, that's the main reason. Now, coming back to the point, Azure Active Directory is just like a book or a website which lists details, right? Azure Active Directory is needed for you to establish secure authentication and centralized management of network resources. It can be your devices as well, right? So in other words, Azure Active Directory is also known as identity source or identity provider. In VMware, when I used to work for VMware, the domain other name was identity source. Here at Microsoft, they call it identity provider, right? No matter what name is, the basic job is it's a simple database which keeps information about your users, your computers, your applications, your security groups, right? Your devices, all that in one place. Now, a few points on Azure Active Directory. Flat architecture, no OUs, no GPUs, OAuth 2.0 SAML, OpenID Connect are a few of the modern authentication protocols that it supports. It's a cloud-based identity solution and it supports Microsoft Graph API for management purposes. What you see on this section of the screen is a quick comparison between Active Directory domain services and Azure Active Directory. Check it out. It's somewhat important, right? If you look at the diagram clearly shows, hey, the intersection point between these two solutions is management of users and groups. Because that's what they do. They offer authentication and authorization. One is for the on-premise, one is for the cloud. So whenever you hear the term ADDS, you need a domain controller, right? That's why I've written require domain controller. It's an on-premise solution. Whenever you see Azure Active Directory, no domain controllers. It's a platform as a service, which means it's a cloud solution. When I talk about Active Directory, it has something called a hierarchical structure, which is where we're talking about domains, subdomains, OUs, security groups, object. This is what we call it as a tree. You can have multiple trees. That's what we call it as a forest. Then between forests, you can have trust relationships. All this you can do. ADDS is vast, right? Now, consider to that, Azure Active Directory is flat, which means we don't have the concept of OUs. We don't have the concepts of GPOs. So that's something to consider for. Authentication protocols, your ADDS supports LDAP, NTLM, and Kerberos, whereas Azure Active Directory supports OAuth, SAML, OpenID, and WS Federation. I'm going to pause here for 20 seconds, check out the points on screen, and let me know if you have any questions. Give me a thumbs up if you're following me so far. Thank you. Let's get going. And whenever people talk about IAM, the most important point I always try them to remember is this red box. One Azure Active Directory is equal to one tenant is equal to a single organization's directory, which means one Azure Active Directory represents one organization. Now, from day before yesterday's topic, we understood when we discussed about governance subscriptions, we understood that a single organization can have multiple subscriptions. This is where we said, hey, if I have multiple departments, and if each department wants to manage the resources independently and wants to keep the resources isolated, they can have their own subscription. That's what we have learned. So there's always a trust relationship between your Azure Active Directory and the subscription. What do you mean? Azure Active Directory can have many subscriptions associated to it. So that's why the one-to-many relationship. However, at any given point of time, a subscription will only be managed by one Azure Active Directory, right? It always has a one-to-one trust relationship. What does that mean? Multiple Azure Active Directories cannot share the same subscription. The subscription can either be in one place or the other place. It can't be at both places at any given point of time. So check out the diagram. Let me know if you have any questions. This generally talks about the relationship between an Azure Active Directory and a subscription. All good so far? Thanks for the thumbs up. So now let's get going. Some terms which you should be aware of. What do you mean by account? What do you mean by identity? What do you mean by Azure account? What do you mean by subscription, tenant, and resource group? We know what subscription is. Let's start with what we already know. Subscription is mainly used for billing purpose, logical boundary for your resources. Because every time you want to deploy a resource, the first thing it will ask you is subscription. Tenant represents a single organization, represents a single directory. The resource group, it's just like a folder. Yes, Vijay.
Sorry to interrupt you. So when we say tenant, one organization, does it mean the management group or what?
No. Management group, what was the purpose? You tell me.
Basically, it's a container for your hierarchical structure of your organization.
That's correct. So the main purpose of management groups, if you remember, was to keep your subscriptions, right? And you're right. Management groups help me mimic organization structure, which means if an organization like Contoso has 7 subscriptions, what can I do? I can create Contoso as management group, and then within this I can create departments like HR, IT, marketing, and within I can create geographical location 1, Geo1, geographical location 2, and within this I can go with prod, test, test, and here I can give each of them a subscription, the key sign here. Does that make sense? So this structure is what management groups allows you to do. But management group doesn't do authentication. Management group doesn't do authorization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. That's
So
right.
now coming back to this point, when I say tenant, I'm just representing your Azure Active Directory. So go back. What is the network saying? Tenant is nothing but your Azure Active Directory. That's what you should remember. Okay? Whenever somebody says tenant, it's just an Azure Active Directory. Can tenant have multiple management groups? Yep. You can have 6 levels of depth. That's what we have learned, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically, one tenant can map with the 7 subscriptions, or
Yeah.
or
Works.
one. Okay. So one, or even we can distribute the tenant to each subscription as well.
You're not distributing. Your subscriptions are under your tenants.
Subscriptions are under tenant. Okay, all right.
So, see here, your subscriptions are mapped to a single directory, single tenant.
Yeah, that's correct. So what I'm trying to say is, we can have two options. Let's say 7 subscriptions can be mapped to one AD tenant, or each subscriptions can be mapped to different tenants. So
Yeah.
if we 7 subscriptions, then 7 tenants.
Yeah, but keep in mind, here the example is 7 departments. You don't create separate Azure Active Directory for each department. Remember that.
Yeah.
Azure Active Directory remains same for the whole organization, isn't it? What you do is, for each department, you create 7 different security groups. Or, if you want organization units, something like that, you would create something called administrative units here in Azure Active Directory. Okay?
Okay, understood.
Okay, wonderful. So let's get going. Good questions. Get them clarified. Don't be confused. Okay? Tenant means Azure Active Directory. Management group doesn't do authentication and authorization. The purpose of management group is solely to implement organization-wide restrictions. Okay, if I want to restrict something by creating a policy, where do I apply this policy? Remember, while creating a policy, it will ask for a scope, right? 4 levels of hierarchy: management group, subscription, resource group, resource. So you have to select how you want to control your resources, how you want to maintain compliance. That's where the management groups come handy. However, when we are talking about authentication, which means which user can manage those management groups, that's where Azure Active Directory comes into play. Okay? So what do you mean by account? Account is nothing but data associated with an identity. Example, account can be Habib. Account can be information associated to Habib. Habib is the identity, object that can be authenticated. What I've given you here, eventually I should not have given this, but this is like my PIN number, which is my kind of visa here in Singapore, and then PAN number. and speed. So this is how my PAN number would be, and 8M, 5 to 8M. So that's my PIN number. So anything back in India, if I need to file my taxes, I need to have a permanent account number. We call it as PAN number. So that's an account number, right? Similarly, in Singapore, if I want to file taxes, I must have a PIN number because I'm a foreigner. So I have something called foreigner identification number, which we call it as PIN number, which is for everything. It is my visa. It is my go-to point for any transactions that I do here in Singapore, right? So that's your account. Identity is Hubby. Account is information associated with Hubby. What is an Azure account? An account that has been created in Azure Active Directory. Okay. What is a tenant? A tenant represents a single directory, a single Azure Active Directory. What is a resource group? A resource group is just a folder to manage your resources. Give me a thumbs up if these statements are making sense, if you're able to follow me. Thanks, Vijay. Thank you, others. I see 13 people in the room today. We already discussed about the different editions. So this is what we said. As an architect, when you want to design an Azure Active Directory, the first question should be, hey, is it going to be a cloud-only solution or is it going to be a hybrid solution? What do you mean by hybrid? Hybrid means you have on-premise environment and you have cloud. So this is where you'll bring an Azure AD Connect, which acts like a bridging component between these two, which is what we have learned when we were talking about federated authentication a while ago. Cloud identity solution means there is no on-premise setup. Everything is cloud native. So this is what I said. Hey, provide unified access management. So those are the 2 points. I don't want two identity providers like AD and Azure Active Directory. I want one guy to take the complete control of identity. So that's exactly what we have mentioned here. And then second thing, we said, hey, we need secure adaptive access, simplify identity governance, unified identity management, seamless user experience. Example, SSPR, self-service password reset, which we have already discussed. Any questions before we go to the next topic? The next topic is to talk about B2B. What do you mean by B2B? What do you mean by B2C? We will talk about that. Then we will go forward. All good so far, people? Thank you. Let's talk about B2B. Now, to talk about B2B, let me ask a simple question. How many of you have not created an account in Azure Active Directory before? If you have not created an account, please raise your hand. Thanks, Vijay. Creating an account in Azure Active Directory is easy. All you have to do is go to your portal, home, see here, portal.azure.com, search for Azure Active Directory, which will bring you Azure Active Directory. Then go to users, then you will create user. See here, there is new user, create new user. Wait a minute. What is this invite external user? So this is where B2B comes into play. When you want to invite people who are not part of your organization to get access to your organization resources, maybe for example, you are working with a partner and you want to invite partner employees to access your application and other resources so that you guys can collaborate on a project. Once the project is over, you can just go ahead and remove this account, right? So that's where the invite button comes into picture. I'm just going to show you the interface, okay? When you click on create new user, check this out. It asks for user principal name, display name, password. That's it. You can define properties like job title, company name, department, full name, all these information, okay? That's your create new user. But the moment you go to invite, you see the template changes. For invite, it asks, hey, who do you want to invite? That's where it's asking you for the email address. Remember that. So the main difference here that we are trying to highlight here is For create user, you have to provide all your details. For invite user, the only detail that I need is an email address and a message that you want to send over. So what will happen when I invite somebody? Let me show it to you. Let me just go to my personal email ID because I've invited myself already before. So I should have an email from Contoso. Yeah, you will receive an email like this. System administrator invited you to access applications within their organization. Which is the system administrator? The account with which I've logged in to the portal. See here, this is the account, admin at MNG environment 830173. So that's the email address. And then whatever message that you have given while inviting the user, that message will show up here saying that let's collab, which means let's collaborate. All I have to do is just click on the link and accept the invitation. So I'll just click on the link to accept the invitation. And what it does is, for the first time, it will give you a pop-up saying that we are going to collect this information from your login. So you just say yes to that. And then you select the account with which you want to log in. So I'm logging in with this account. And then it will take me to myapplications.microsoft.com where it says there are no applications to show. So what I'm trying to highlight here is, when you get invitation and when you go ahead and log in to the link that has been sent, you will see all the applications that have been shared with you. So that's the main purpose of B2B. So that's what I've written on the whiteboard. Here, B2B, mainly used for collaboration purposes. How are we collaborating? By inviting a guest. So what are we doing to access your resources? So if you go back to the portal, home, user section, you will see something called member and you will see guest. Wherever you see guest, guest is basically an external party, which means if you look at the user principal name of the guest account and the member account, that will be different. Here, I've just copied over two different accounts. One is for a user called Gopi, the other one is called Habib. And as you can see here, Habib's is gmail.com. Gopi is a local user, Gopi at, and it gives you the domain name. So that's why the member versus guest. Whenever you see guest, guest means on. Yeah. So whenever we are talking about member means a local account, guest means an external user. So just give me a thumbs up if you understood the difference between create and invite when we select invite option. Thanks for the thumbs up. So now going back to the whiteboard. So the main purpose here is to collaborate. Okay, how does it get started? Okay, user receives an email with a link. I've just shown you that. So if you go back to my email, the user receives the email with a link. Once he accepts the link, here authentication happens at source, which means the user would log in. You saw I logged in with Habib, and then authorization happens at the destination. What do you mean by this? Whatever permissions you have defined for that user, because if you go back here, I can click on this account, guest account. I can go to assign roles. I can click on add assignment. And then I can give any role that I want. For example, I want to make this guy a user administrator so that he can manage all the user account and the related operations. I can make it active, which means he is going to have that role active right away. And there you go. So this is exactly what I've written there. So if you minimize it, it says authorization happens at the destination. So Habib belongs to Microsoft. Let's say I'm inviting Vijay, who belongs to Westpac, right? So Habib sends an invitation email to Vijay. Vijay will accept the invitation. Once he accepts the invitation, Vijay's object, the user principal object, gets created in Habib's directory. And using this principal object, I can configure roles and permissions. Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me so far. On the left hand, on the right hand side, we are just giving you the link.
Habib.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
So I was just comparing this diagram, how B2B works. So let's say Habib belongs to the Microsoft company, and we have a person by name Louis who is working for Westpac, another company, right? So when Habib wants to invite Louis to access his resources, which could be an application, which could be Teams or a calendar or any other resource, right? SharePoint Online. So what am I doing? I'm sending out an email. So what will Louis do? Louis will receive an email with a link. What will happen when he accepts that link? Object of Louis gets created in Habib's Azure Active Directory. So what can Habib do? He can configure permissions for that person Louis. So that's what we have discussed. Does that make sense?
And the permission is actually not based on the RBAC, right? It is solely the permission on the Azure AD.
Yeah. Again, you can configure RBAC permissions as well. Now, whenever you say
okay.
It is basically a resource associated permission configuration. So if you see this screen now, active assignments, user administrator. What does this mean? Habib, who's a guest user, can manage all the user accounts in your directory because this is the permission that you have given. Let me remove this. Okay. I'll just remove this, removing role assignment, which means he's back to the member. The active duration is too short. Minimum required is 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so we haven't completed 5 minutes assigning this role. But let's talk about RBAC. Okay, I'll go back to home. I go back to storage accounts. I select the storage account. I go to IAM. I go to roles. And role assignments. I'll click on add role assignment. Now it is asking me, what role do you want to go with? I want to go with privileged role. Let's say I want to make this guy an owner. Now I want to select a user or a group or a service principal, select members. And this is where I'm going to search for Habib. Remember, Habib is a guest user account. But the question is he listed? See here, he's listed. Guest. And then I'll just select the guest. Click next. Check out this details. Hey, Habib, who's a guest user account, can be assigned the role called owner for this particular object, which is your storage account. Does that make sense? So I can just review and assign. That's it.
Okay.
Right. So it's completely dependent on what you want to give access to. Because you're the one who's inviting. Once you have invited, the object is created in your Azure Active Directory, which is this. And from there, you can use that object anywhere in the cloud and define your permissions. See here, once he accepts the invitation, that object gets created automatically here, which is if I search with the keyword guest. Does that make sense? Following me so far?
Yeah, makes sense. So my assumption is as long as the user is invited and it is basically listed under our AD, that the privilege can be the same as the existing internal members, right? Subject to whatever role we assign to them.
Exactly. So it's subject to whatever role you have assigned. By default, what access does a member have? Nothing, right?
Correct.
It's just the user. But you have to do that role assignment. Now, where are you doing that role assignment? Let's go back to day 1 whiteboard. So, just to refresh our knowledge. We'll go back to day 1 whiteboard where we were talking about governance. You will see that green box, blue box. Remember that. See here, this box. So once you have the account in the Azure Active Directory, you decide whether this account should manage your Azure Active Directory or the Azure resources itself. Depending upon that, you decide where to go. For example, if you want him to manage Azure Active Directory, you would go to Home, Azure Active Directory, Roles and Administrators. But if you want to manage him via RBAC, to manage resources, then you would go to the Resource, IAM, Role Assignment. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes sense. Thank you.
Where do we find our resource group? Like if I'm using API to create a user, it asks me for resource group, service name, and all the details.
Okay. So again, resource group is just a logical container, which means it's again a resource, right? Which means that can be configured for resource groups as well. So for this, I'll go back to my portal, Home, Search for resource groups. You all have resource group in the list? No. So let's search for it. RESOUR. Resource groups will also have, let me pick any resource group because this is just an example. It also has an IAM section. Then you go to role assignment, then you do the same thing. Add role assignment, then you select the member who you want to add. Here in this case, I can just search for the guest, which in my scenario is Hubby. And then we are good to go.
Right, okay. Thanks.
Okay. The same thing. It's just a resource. And whenever we are talking about resource, going back to the whiteboard, this box should come into play, the blue box, owner contributor data. Whenever we want the access to be limited to Azure Active Directory, the green box should come into play. If you want to give both, do the elevated access, which we have discussed. So that was good questions. Keep them coming. So what we'll do is, it's already 10:30. Let me give you the first 15 minutes break. Once we are back, we will get started with B2B versus B2C. After that, we're going to talk about conditional access policies a little bit. Sign-in risk versus user risk, identity protection, identity governance, a quick introduction to all the topics, application registration, then stop the lecture. So approximately 45 minutes of lecture is still what I've got. And then after that, we're going to jump into application architecture before we go for lunch. So that after lunch, we can keep it simple. We can talk about your integration options with storage and a little bit of monitoring. Okay, so take a break, come back in 15, and we will continue forward. So let me bring up the timer here. 15 minutes. Stepping away now, guys. Thank you.